This presentation prepares you for the first of the quizzes that focuses on ethics, specifically on the kinds of ethical decisions all people make every day, and on how understanding our own ethical principles can lead us to conduct ourselves ethically as technical communicators. Even though in everyday language the word rhetoric seems to refer to innately unethical language that manipulates in order to persuade at any cost, we can see in that colloquial usage the very strong tie between rhetoric and ethics. Rhetorical awareness, understanding the power of language and other communication symbols, also leads to the ability to use the symbols we communicate with to persuade ethically, with respect for the facts, for the values of our audience, and for our own good reputation, or ethos. We all make decisions every day, and we all consult some kind of guide to our behavior in order to do so, even if we don't do so consciously. If we didn't have internal ethical systems, we wouldn't even be able to choose between soup or salad for lunch. People who think that rhetoric is completely unethical would say that the only thing guiding our decisions is appetite, meaning whatever we want to satisfy ourselves. But even choosing between soup and salad is more than a choice of appetite, involving also the relative costs and our resources, as well as the nutritional value of one or the other. Other decisions that seem more important ethically, such as whether to tell the truth or a small or big lie, refer to the same ethical structures for guidance. Philosophers have identified recurring patterns of ethical choices and have given those structures a few names based on their typical characteristics. I've provided at the Quizzes button a brief summary of ethical systems that you need to look at as you go through the rest of this presentation, because I'm using the names of the ethical systems described in that summary. The same document is also available in a full-size version at a link that I've also provided on Blackboard. When I was a paralegal, I worked at a large law firm whose partners were almost all members of the Republican Party. They represented large companies and wealthy individuals, and I was hired specifically to work on the pension plans of medical corporations. Because I'd grown up in a lower middle-class blue-collar family, I felt uncomfortable working for what I saw as rich people, and I especially didn't like the fact that part of my job was to calculate the maximum amount of money that the doctor owners could put into a pension plan for themselves each year, while putting in the absolute minimum amount they were forced to contribute under the tax laws to their employees, secretaries, office managers, and receptionists, almost all women who made much less money than the doctors did, who were almost all men at that time, but made their medical practice possible. And in fact, I did a lot of work that went out under the signatures of male attorneys who made a lot more money than I did and couldn't have gotten their jobs done if not for my work. When I mentioned to my attorney boss that I thought it would be better to work for legal aid and help poor people with their legal problems, he said to me, "Rich people need help too." That didn't make me feel any better about my job, but it does provide us with a small case study for using ethical terms. My boss and I agreed on the basic principle. Human beings should be helpful to other human beings. For my boss, it didn't matter which ones we were helpful to. For me, it did matter because I believed that being helpful to one group was harmful to another group, and I wanted to help the group that I believed I was harming. In the terms that Dr. Hinman provides in the summary that I've given you, my boss and I agreed on the character-oriented approach. See Hinman's slide 3. In other words, about the kind of persons we should be. But we disagreed on the act-oriented approach. I was concerned about the results of my actions. See consequentialism on Hinman's slide 4. And he was looking at the tax rules and following them, what's called deontology on Hinman's slide. As a consequentialist, at least in that situation, I was primarily concerned about the consequences for myself and other people like me. That's called group consequentialism on Hinman's slide 7. I believe that I was also using the yardstick of idealism as shown on Hinman's slide 9. specifically the ideal of fairness. In this particular situation, I thought it was only fair that people whose work was essential to the goal of an organization should be paid accordingly and valued for their contribution to the organization, rather than being seen by the owners simply as an expensive burden. That puts me in the shaded part of this diagram from Hinman's slide 8, at least in terms of my position in that particular situation. In just this particular case, and notice I keep saying that, my boss's rule-oriented position on Hinman's slide 12 held that following the tax rules trumped all consequences. He may very well have also believed that in the larger picture, the lower-paid workers were compensated for the disadvantage of getting less salary and less retirement benefits. And in fact, they were. The tax rules allowed the doctors to give their employees less in the pension plan because lower-paid workers get more money paid in Social Security taxes by their employers than higher-paid ones, at least as a percentage of total income. To me, although that falls into the green shaded area that considers consequences for all human beings as a group, that was not very good compensation. Now, two last comments on that situation before I send you off to take the Rhetoric and Ethics quiz. First, I could have told myself that the secretaries, office managers, and receptionists were perfectly satisfied with their jobs, salaries, and benefits, given that they had presumably knowingly chosen their jobs. Presumably, in other words, had chosen not to go to med school and become doctors because they had other goals in life, such as having more time with their families than they might have as doctors, maybe. That's the yardstick that Hinman calls preference satisfaction on slide 9. However, I still believe that some people don't really have the option of going to medical school, even if they wanted to, and that when I was a young woman, such people included most women, who were not encouraged to become doctors or lawyers, but instead to become their nurse and paralegal helpers. Again, I seem to be concerned for group consequentialism using as a yardstick the ideal of fairness. And now here's the last thing. What I've just walked you through is my own analysis of one situation that took place years ago. My boss might not agree with my representation of his opinion. Also, both of us might adopt different positions on different issues or at different times. I'm not always a group consequentialist using fairness as a yardstick, and my boss is not always a deontologist using happiness as his utilitarian yardstick. For example, Dr. Hinman mentions religious approaches on slide 14 before moving to what seems to be his preferred approach, pluralism, on slide 15. Having been brought up in a Protestant Christian tradition, I acknowledge that many of my ethical decisions are based in the 10 Commandments, whether I look at the list of all 10 when I'm trying to decide something or not. While not everyone has a religious position, though, all human beings do have ethical positions, whether they can give names to them or not. Nations, too, have ethical positions. The United States First Amendment, for example, which guarantees freedom of speech, seems to agree with point number 3 under pluralism, that it's helpful to have recourse to alternative positions. Our rhetorical abilities, what I've defined as our ability to persuade people based on our own character, the facts, and shared or divergent values, allow us to engage in activities and practices with other people with understanding and tolerance. My boss and I didn't try to persuade each other to share our views, instead deciding to agree to disagree. But if it had been important for me to convince him I was right, or vice versa, I could have appealed to his religious values, that we should help the poor, which he did by serving on the boards of many nonprofit organizations and donating a great deal of money and time to them, or to his empathy for me. In that case, I would have pointed out that my job didn't give me either enough money to contribute to organizations or time off to do work for them, especially as a single mother. In other words, good rhetorical skills don't turn people into bullies. Bullies may be very good at using rhetorical skills, but the very first book written about rhetoric, by Aristotle in the 4th century BCE, maintained that rhetorical skills would usually lead to good things, because he believed that truth and justice were more powerful than their opposites and would prevail in an ethical argument. Remember that idea when you hear newscasters and pundits suggesting that rhetoric is a bunch of BS. Rhetoric actually makes our world what it is. End of rhetorical sermon. The Rhetoric and Ethics quiz asks you to write 250 words or less, that's about one double-spaced page, about an ethical decision you remember participating in, using the terms I've used in this presentation to describe how you or others acted in the situation, and whether you or others responded to persuasion based in facts, values, or personal character, also known as logos, pathos, and ethos. I will grade you based not on the situation or whether I agree with its outcome, but on whether you're understanding and using the ethical terminology correctly. And of course, you can keep this presentation, Dr. Hinman's summary, and any other materials you want open on your desktop while you take the quiz. Be sure to take the quiz by 11:59 p.m. on the deadline so that you don't miss out on your quiz point.